Welcome, everybody. My name is Isabel de la Cruz Ernst. I'm the daughter of Carlos and Rosa de la Cruz of this beautiful private collection. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of them and of Yvette Yanez, the director of our space. So tonight we have a very special guest speaker, Hans Ulrich Obrist. Not only is a personal friend of the families, but he's had many special connections here in Miami. And he worked in the creation of his 2017 exhibition called The Uncertain States of America. So currently, Hans is the artistic director of the Serpentine Gallery in London. So I'm sure you've seen his wonderful museum. He's a prolific curator, a critic who has organized over 300 different exhibitions and considerable publications. So we're very honored to have him here with us this evening. Thank you. I want to thank, obviously, my parents for having invited Hans and all of you for coming. And we especially want to thank Cadillac for sponsoring this event. As a little side, my great-grandmother used to have a V12 four-door convertible Cadillac in Cuba, in Havana, in probably the 1950s, no? So obviously, I never saw the car, but my father was telling us. So it must have been quite a hit in Havana at the time. So she also had one in Spain when she moved to Madrid. So before we begin, I ask you to silence your phones on behalf of the courtesy for the speaker this evening. I also want to thank our wonderful staff that has made this possible tonight. So a round of applause for all the hard work they've done. Thank you, Yvette, and all the staff. And now I want to welcome Hans to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Thank you so much to Rosa and to Carlos, to Yvette, to the amazing team here. And thank you all very much for being here. And as Isabel said in the introduction, it's a very long friendship. I'm very grateful for this 20-year of friendship with Rosa and Carlos, which really started when we collaborated on an exhibition at the Sir John Soane's Museum in London, one of my first shows in London called Retrace Your Steps, Remember Tomorrow. And it happened in the Sir John Soane's Museum, and the collaboration was actually a film by Isaac Julian, who lived for some time in the Sir John Soane's house and produced a film. I thought tonight to do a new lecture about new experiments in art and technology. And it all kind of began when I met Billy Kluwer about 15, 20 years ago, the visionary founder of Experiments for Art and Technology. He told me a lot about these amazing residencies he created for artists in the Bell Laboratories, where artists and engineers would collaborate. And actually, a couple of days ago, I was in New York City visiting Lilian Schwartz, who was one of the protagonists of Billy Kluwer's Experiments in Art and Technology, who is now 92 years old, and told me about these amazing experiences, how really artists and scientists and engineers produce for many years reality together. So this is it. These are experiments in art and technology. Tonight I'm going to talk about NEAT, which is new experiments in art and technology. And it's kind of interesting that in the introduction to the second edition of the book Understanding Media, Marshall McLuhan noted the ability of art to anticipate the future social and also technological development. Art, McLuhan wrote, is an early alarm system, pointing us to new developments in times ahead and allowing us to prepare to cope with them. Art as a radar environment takes on the function of indispensable perceptual training. In 1964, when McLuhan's book was first published, the artist Namjoon Paik was just about to build his robot, K456, to experiment with the technologies that would subsequently start to influence society. He had worked with television earlier, challenging its usual passive consuming by the viewer, and later made art with global live satellite broadcasts using the new media less for entertainment than to point us to the poetic and also intercultural capacities. And it is, I think, these poetic and intercultural capacities of technology which are interesting again today. And I realized over the last couple of years in many conversations with artists that they really wanted again to collaborate with science and engineers, and so that it was somehow time to start these new experiments for art and technology. Besides, of course, Billy Kluwer, there was another inspiration, and that's Barbara Stevini, and John Latham, who created the Artist Placement Group. They basically said that every company, every government should have an artist in residence, which is still a great idea, I think, to realize today. The world would be a better place if that would happen. And so we thought to do that at the Serpentine and invited the artist and thinker Ben Vickers to be initially our digital curator. And then when 2 years ago, our CEO Jana Piel and I thought that we really wanted to make technology center stage at the Serpentine, appointed Ben to be our Chief Technology Officer, our CTO. We felt it's good that an art institution has a CTO, and at the same time the continuation of this idea of the Artist Placement Group. And one of the first things Ben suggested was that we would do these digital commissions. You see here a first example by James Bridle, who has just written an absolutely remarkable book called The New Dark Age. It's about how the information age can be very destructive for knowledge and how the apparent accessibility of our information society actually turns into the opposite due to the fact that most people who use these tools often don't understand them. For the Serpentine, James did Cloud Index, which is a weather prediction model, which you can see here. A vast amount of data is gathered about historic weather patterns from satellite. So it's very much an artwork about big data, and he correlates that data with polling events, for example, the Brexit vote, as you can see here. Now, whenever I work, and that has always been part of my practice, it's about learning, it's about listening. I think Etelatnan, the poet, once said the 20th century was a lot about proclaiming manifestos, and maybe in the 21st century we should learn again to listen. So for me, listening has been always at the core of my practice, which is why I have been recording these conversations with artists, with architects. And so, of course, when we started this research in technology, I started to apply my usual methodology. I have an archive of so far about 3,900 hours of these conversations. And so I started to do the same with technological pioneers. Here an example, Vitalik Buterin, with whom I discussed the crypto-economic approach, where he basically is interested in this notion of the truth. He is the inventor of Ethereum, a cryptocurrency, which for him is a world computer. Or if one has to say it in slightly more words, it's a global decentralized system that is designed to implement a set of rules and which is designed to ensure that everyone can participate in the system, and the way people interact with each other will always be processed in the exact way people expect it to be. So this idea of a world computer, of Ethereum, was the topic of this conversation, which really grew out of an exhibition we did with Simon Denny, who was very interested in this idea of blockchain actually, leading to a more utopian kind of more global spread. So here you see the interview with Vitalik Buterin, which you can also find online, and that was the beginning of many such conversations. And of course, after a certain while, we felt it would be important to also bring these new experiments in technology, in art and technology, into the exhibitions, to not only have them on the website, but to actually bring them into the physical space. And the first time that happened was actually when we worked on the Zaha Hadid show of her early paintings and her early drawings. I was supposed to have lunch with Zaha a few days before her lecture at the RIBA, which so sadly became her last, basically her last lecture. And she canceled the lunch because she said she had to prepare the lecture, but that I should come to her talk. So I went to the talk, and in the lecture, I discovered for the first time, she had never talked about this before, her extraordinary notebooks. Notebooks which connect really to her early calligraphy, and where we can see that actually at the beginning of her childhood and adolescence in Baghdad, and then her studies in Beirut, she worked a lot with calligraphy and invented really this fluidity of her later digital architecture, all out of these hand-drawn, amazing drawings. And I texted her the same night after the lecture, and I said, we've got to see these amazing drawings. And we then rescheduled the lunch and basically would meet at her place. And I realized that she had thousands and thousands of these drawings, which she had never exhibited. So we started to plan an exhibition, which very sadly then had to be realized without her because of her tragic passing. We basically wanted to make a retrospective of all her early drawings, all her early calligraphies. and at the same time realize her unrealized project to actually realize them in virtual reality. Because many of these drawings have an extraordinary amount of dimensions, as you can see here. And in this conversation, which was the last conversation we had, Zaha said that she would love this idea that one could extrapolate, is that the word in English? Extrapolate, into many more dimensions, her drawings. And so we worked with the Google Cultural Institute on a virtual reality dimension of this exhibition and presented the drawing. And that, of course, means also with new experiment of art and technology that actually museums have new alliances with new partners in the world of technology, as with this exhibition here. That continued then when we had the Christo exhibition this summer at the Serpentine, when again we, of course, realized and built Christo's work, yet at the same time had also a VR component. This time it was a collaboration with Acute. Daniel Birnbaum has just joined Acute, the museum director of Moderna Musik, and is basically an organization which produces artists' virtual reality projects. So we realized Christo's mastaba on the Serpentine Lake, and that's another methodology of mine besides the interviews. I always have one question which is recurrent, where I would always ask artists, what is their unrealized project? Because I think it's so interesting that we know a lot about architects' unrealized projects because they always publish them, but we know nothing about visual artists' unrealized projects. And I realized that when I spoke to Louise Bourgeois, who was almost 100 years old, and she told me her dream was to build a little amphitheater. And no one knew that, right? She wanted to build that little theater. And I just realized it's really important to map these unrealized artist projects, to talk about them, and then hopefully help them to be realized. No? So it's not talking about them just in order to document them, but it's in order to produce reality. So we worked with Christo, Jana Peel and I on the bridge between our two spaces, and we halted on the bridge looking at that lake, and I asked Christo, what is your unrealized project? And he told us that his dream was actually to build this mastaba. He wanted it to build on Lake Michigan in the late 60s, and it was unrealized, and he wanted to build one in the desert, a very big one, and another one, also big, 20 meters, on a lake. So, and then we turned, looked at the lake, and said, let's do it. And then, of course, it was a big collaboration, thanks to our chairman, Mike Bloomberg, and Bloomberg Philanthropies. Mike had already actually enabled Christo to do the gates in New York City. Of course, also the mayor of London, as well as also the Royal Parks, Westminster, many, many stakeholders. Again, lots of collaborations to make this project of Christo happen, both as a physical reality and also as a VR project. And of course, talking about Christo and about building, projects, producing reality, leads us also to our Pavilion series, which started in 2000 with Zaha Hadid, was also a trustee of the gallery, and she started with Julia Peyton-Johns to actually do this first pavilion. And the pavilion is now going to its 19th year, and it always happens on this little piece of grass, on this lawn in front of the gallery, because we believe that, to exhibit architecture, the best way is not to exhibit models, but the best way is actually to build it. So I joined in 2006, so the first pavilion I was involved with was the Rem Koolhaas Pavilion with Cecil Balmond, where Rem designed a pavilion which would actually eventually on sunny days be able to fly high up, and then it could be pulled back, almost like a balloon. It was also like a speech bubble. Then we worked with Olafur Eliasson and Kjetil Thorsen of Snøhetta on this spiral. So here it's a collaboration between an artist and an architect, which we also thought would be interesting to explore. We then invited Frank Gehry, who connected it to Speaker's Corner, a very open structure. And the rule of the game is that it's always architects who have never built in the UK. It is their first built structure. So none of these architects had ever built, in London before. Sana brought in the outside into the inside, very much like Lina Bobardi said, the outsides are on the inside, the insides are on the outside, with this mirroring structure. Jean Nouvel created a multiple playground to play chess, to play ping pong, very, multi-layered sort of campus. And then almost the opposite, because of course the architects also react to what happens in the previous years. They look very carefully what has been done. So Peter Zumthor did the exact opposite. He created a space of silence, almost like a cloister. And in the middle of it was basically Pete Udov's garden. We brought them together because Peter Zumthor wanted to work with a landscape architect, so we introduced him to Pete Udov, and they developed this together. Next year, again, an artist and architect collaboration. It was Ai Weiwei together with Herzog de Meuron, and they decided for the first time to actually dig, right? So it would go into the ground, and layers and layers of memory of all the previous pavilions. And you might wonder what all of this has to do with my theme, with the new experiments, in art and technology. And it, of course, has to do with the fact that we hope in the future now to soon work with AR, so to go from VR to AR, and actually have this possibility to bring pavilions who are no longer there, which are no longer there, back through augmented reality, right? Because in a way, it would be very wonderful, because all of these pavilions have a second life. They go to another city, but it would be very wonderful if the memory of the previous pavilions, a bit like they were digging here, the memory, if that could be there virtually, and visitors could, reactivate the memory of these previous pavilions through AR. Here, Sue Fujimoto, to go into a younger generation, was important from 2013 onwards, who built this almost cloud-like pavilion. And again, it's about a lot of alliances, collaborations. So this pavilion, as a collaboration with the Luma Foundation, is now in Tirana, actually with Edi Rama, because that's a great example for the artist placement group, because Albania has an artist as prime minister. The painter and artist Edi Rama, who is a very old friend of Andri Sala, is now the prime minister, and he brought this pavilion to Tirana, where you can see it for the next 3 years. Smiljan Radic, a kind of a soucoupe volante, and then the very colorful scheme of Sel Gascano, which led us to Bjarke Ingels. And then in 2017, Jana Piel and I thought that it would be very interesting to kind of start yet a new evolution of the pavilion. So we wanted to open it up and not just invite one architect, but to have several offices to be invited, so that it's a more open process. And at the same time, we also felt it would be important to have a committee with 2 architects. So David Adje and Richard Rogers joined us, together with the engineer David Glover, our architecture curator Amira Gard. And together we basically map now all year long young emerging architecture offices, and then select a young architect to build the scheme. Francis Kere in 2017 from Burkina Faso, who is based in Berlin, who created this tree structure, basically a pavilion where a lot of community activities also happened. The idea that every week it was given over to other activist groups who would actually give a different content to the pavilion. And that brings us to 2018. The youngest architect so far, Frida Escobedo, who created a Mexican gelosilla, a structure which basically created a cool breeze in the more tropical climate in London. And at the same time, she very much connected this Mexican pavilion to local materials. She created this gelosilla actually with tiles and a lot of optics. There was water, there were mirrors, and there were lots of niches also for more intimate gatherings, and then a big, meeting space. And that's what Tim Berners-Lee said when, in 1989, he invented the World Wide Web. This is for everyone. And I believe that this is very important today in terms of art institution. It's our motto. This is for everyone. And of course, Tim Berners-Lee reiterates the importance of this is for everyone at this very moment in time when net neutrality is somehow endangered, right? So he wants to fight for net neutrality, and that's why he emphasizes this has to be for everyone. And the same thing is true, I think, with art institutions. We have free admission for 1.2 million visitors every year, and I believe that it's extremely important to have access for everyone. Free admission is our mantra, but as in a way I found out last year, free admission is not enough. We kind of need to do more. We worked with Arthur Jafa, and he said, we need to do exhibitions which which go to the people. We cannot just wait for visitors to come. And that became to me crystal clear when we had a visitor actually in the pavilion, and I actually found out about it because I came back from a trip super early one morning, like something like at 6 a.m., and I went directly to the office. And obviously the taxi driver assumed I would work there because no one would visit the gallery at 6 a.m. So he said that he always wanted to meet someone who works at the Serpentine. And I asked him why, so he told me the story of what happened to his daughter. He went on a walk with his daughter last summer, and all of a sudden his daughter ran into the pavilion. Because of course the pavilion has no doors. It's open. It's you know, it goes to the visitors. It's in the park. And he says his daughter had an epiphany. She now always reads architecture books and wants to become an architect, and so he wanted to thank us. And so I said if he also had visited the exhibition, and he said no, because he would never go to a museum. I'd never ever. And so I said, why? And then there was a moment of silence, and he said, because it's not for people like me. And that for me made it clear how important it is, in a way, that we go with exhibition, you know, to everyone. And the pavilion are very much about that. Christo's public artwork is also very much about that. And of course, to connect that also to the exhibition, to oscillate between what's happening in the exhibition and outside, is very important. And Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web in 1989 and says this is for everyone, also drew this map for the Serpentine of the World Wide Web. We thought it interesting that the inventor of the World Wide Web, who more than, you know, almost anyone else changed the world in which we live today, would basically make a mapping of the World Wide Web for us. And that's, of course, part of the marathon series, which we do every summer, every autumn. We believe that we can only address the big questions of the 21st century if we go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge, if we bring art together with all the other disciplines. And so every year we have another theme. It started in 2006 with the interview marathon, when Rem Koolhaas and I interviewed 72 people for 24 hours. We were on stage non-stop for 24 hours because we wanted to make a portrait of London. And here is one of these interviews with Doris Lessing. And in a way it was, of course, one can never make a portrait of a city. A city is far too complex. But it was kind of an attempt at this impossibility. And then we basically, the next year after that, Olafur Eliasson said, you know, you've talked enough. Now we need to experiment. We need to go beyond the mere talking. We have to do things. And so that led us to a different format where basically we do not only have conferences and interviews, but we also invite artists, you know, and practitioners from different disciplines to do a performance. So the marathon format became more and more hybrid. It's not a festival, it's not a conference, it's something kind of in between. So the theme, for example, in 2015 was transformation. Here, Dominique Gonzalez-Förster, featuring actually Pina Bausch and Heiner Müller. And then, of course, in the last 2 years, the themes had much more to do with technology. We wanted to address the theme of work this year. So here you see a panel with David Adjil, Inetia Domboaki, and John Gray on the future of work. We collaborated with the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, and of course has a lot to do with this idea that in the age of AI, of artificial intelligence, work might disappear, and how can we contribute to, you know, to produce work in this 21st century. And that was the Artificial Intelligence Marathon, the guest, the ghost, the host, and the machine, which, you know, came directly out of the engagement with the digital programs. We addressed questions such as, is art changing in the age of AI? What are the emerging relationships between machines and the human spirit? If we don't know what consciousness is, how can we then qualify intelligence? Are we too late to define the ethics of the machines? Does the future belong to non-human entities? All these questions were discussed, and we can say, you know, the marathon is in a way like a, what would Molly Nesbitt say, a rendezvous, a meeting place of question marks. It's a place to ask questions. And so here you see Hitler Steil, with whom we are also working on an exhibition for next year. And Hito presented in the context of the marathon on artificial intelligence, AI, the notion of artificial stupidity, AS. She referred to a more general phenomenon, like the now widespread use of Twitter bots. In our conversation, she said, and this is a quote, "It was and still is a very popular tool in elections to deploy Twitter armies to sway public opinion and deflect popular hashtags and so on. This is an artificial intelligence of a very, very low grade. It's 2 or maybe 3 lines of script. It's nothing very sophisticated at all. Yet the social implications of this kind of artificial stupidity, as I call it, are already monumental in global politics." End of quotes. And of course, that is now what we can observe all over the world. Even low-grade AI technology like these bots are influencing our politics. And that, of course, raises another urgent question: how powerful will far more advanced techniques be in the future? Yet there was another aspect which Hito raised in the talk, which I think is very interesting, which is, of course, the question of visibility and invisibility. I grew up in Switzerland, so for me there were 2 artists who somehow brought me to art, and that was Giacometti, the long, thin figures of Giacometti, and then Paul Klee. And Paul Klee would always say that art is about making the invisible visible. And that's exactly what Hito says in the age of AI, because in computer technology, most algorithms work invisibly in the background. They remain inaccessible in the systems we use daily, but lately there has been an interesting comeback of visuality in machine learning. The ways the deep learning algorithms are processing data have been made visible through application like Google's Deep Dream, in which the process of computerized pattern recognition is visualized in real time. The application shows how the algorithm tries to match different forms with any given input. And here again a quote from Hito about this idea of the artist making the invisible visible. Hito says, "For me, this proves that science has become a subgenre of art history. We now have lots of abstract computer patterns that might look like a Paul Klee painting or a Mark Rothko or all sorts of other abstractions that we know from art history. The only difference, I think, is that in current scientific thought, they are perceived as representations of reality, almost like documentary images, whereas in art history, there is a very nuanced understanding of different kinds of abstractions." And that, of course, will also be an important aspect of this new experiment in art and technology we are developing with Hito at the Serpentine for next February. At the very moment, we have the exhibition of Pierre Wieg until February the 10th called Umwelt. And that is a collaboration with a scientific lab in Kyoto, in Japan. So another new experiment in art and technology. Throughout the gallery, you have large LED screens present images which began in the mind of a human. So basically, Pierre is sending images to a scientist in the lab in Kyoto, and the scientist looks at these images, and they go from his brain directly to the machine. So there is no more photography involved. One could call this somehow like machine telepathy or something like that. And of course, the machine has, let's for example say, Pierre sends an image of a dog, which is one of the images in the exhibition. And then the machine has millions and millions and millions of images of dogs. And what you see here, again, the invisible is made visible. You see how the machine searches for the image the scientist thinks of, and you see all these chimeras, and you see so many references to art history. There is Bacon, there is surrealism, and yet something very interesting happens with these screens, because Pierre basically didn't want the loop. He wanted to liberate himself from the loop. And that's, of course, something which is very limiting about moving images, that it always repeats. At some point, there is a loop. So he wanted to create a situation where there would never be repetition. So it would be permanently changing images, and there is also a interdependence with the viewer. So when you enter the space, you change the images, and it's not only you as the visitor, but there is also 100,000 flies who experience the exhibition with you. And that leads us to another experiment, which is the exhibition of Ian Cheng earlier this year. Ian, of course, did the Emissaries trilogy, which is set in a fictional post-apocalyptic world of flora and fauna. in which AI-driven animals and creatures explore the landscape and interact with each other. It uses very advanced graphics, but then there are programmed glitches and imperfections. And we showed these emissaries, but we also wanted to actually premiere a new work, which is the first, basically, work with a central nervous system we had at the gallery. And it's a work called Bob. Bob stands for Bag of Beliefs. It's a character living at the Serpentine. It's not smart, but it's sentient. And unlike the emissaries, which we showed before, Bob is aware of you as a viewer and can interact with you, and you in turn might influence its emotional life. And what Bob believes is basically not interactive art. It's very relevant because Bob can be moody, and Bob could also ignore you. So it's kind of interesting because I looked at the visitor book the other day, you know, where visitors leaving comments, and somebody wrote into the book, Bob was so nice to me, I came back every day. Somebody else wrote into the book, you know, I came all the way from Birmingham and Bob ignored me. And then, of course, you know, one day we got a phone call because Bob was programmed to be there from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. and then go to sleep. And we got a phone call that Bob had woken up at 3 a.m. So, yeah, as Ian says, Bob could become a belief system over time, where you trust Bob to believe things for you, and when you need to see from that belief's orientation towards reality, you just talk to Bob, and Bob tells you. Here, Bob, of course, still in its infancy. Another experiment in art and technology is the exhibition of Sondra Perry. Some of you might have seen it here in Miami because it's a collaboration of the Serpentine with the ICA here in Miami, and also now the exhibition is at the Luma Westbau in Zurich, and it's basically an exhibition where Sondra explores the intersection of Black identity, digital culture, and also power structures through video, media, installation, and also performance. Her use of digital tools and material, ranging from blue screen technology and 3D avatars to found footage from the internet, reflects on these modes of representation and the abstraction of Black identity in art and media. As Sondra Perry told me in an interview, I'm interested in thinking about how Blackness shifts, morphs, and embodies technology to combat oppression and surveillance throughout the diaspora. Blackness is agile. So also in these new site-specific installations Sondra created, she incorporated Graft and Ash for a 3-monitor workstation, a 3D avatar of the artist questioning the current productivity and efficiency culture, and also Wet and Wavy Looks Typhoon Coming, which both references and digitally alters Turner's 1840 painting, the Slave Ship. And Perry is committed, and that leads us back to Tim Berners-Lee's sentence, this is for everyone. Perry is committed to net neutrality and ideas of collective production and action using open source software to edit her work and leasing it digitally for use in galleries and classrooms. So this whole idea that the work can travel also beyond the gallery to classrooms is very important for her. And that, of course, leads us to Do It, because that has been, in a way, the premise of my oldest exhibition I want to talk about tonight, which is an exhibition called Do It, which, like all my exhibitions, is always, at the beginning, is a dialogue with artists. So here, it was with Christian Boltanski and Bertrand Lavier, and the idea was really to do an exhibition which would be constituted by instructions, by how-to manuals. So the artists would, here you have Anna Halprin giving an instruction for a choreography in live, which everybody can just do. A very unusual piece by Felix Gonzalez Torres, who basically gave a very open score to use a certain quantity of locally wrapped candies. And this piece has been realized in more than 100 places all over the world. And of course, is each time very, very different. Or then Michelangelo Pistoletto, for whom the instruction is basically the opposite of Duchamp's ready-made. So it's not bringing something into the museum, but it's bringing found things into the world. So here you have a newspaper sphere, which, you know, the kids can roll into the city. And this exhibition is open source. Similarly, to what Sandra says in terms of the digital work, this exhibition is open source, which means everybody can just do it. And that means also many, many venues all over the world who otherwise could never have done an international exhibition could actually realize this exhibition. What is also important is that wherever this show goes, it learns. So it's the opposite, because I've always had a problem with this idea of traveling shows, because I think it's extremely arrogant that we send an exhibition from one city to the next without taking the local context into consideration. I think the exhibition has to listen, has to look, has to change. And so with Do It, we've made a whole research in each of the more than 100 venues. We looked at local instruction art, and so we have so far more than 500 instructions by artists from all over the world, which constitute this archive. Here are the wish trees of Yoko Ono. And similarly is the case with Take Me, I'm Yours, which is another exhibition which we started with Christian Boltanski, which is basically an exhibition about generosity. It's an exhibition where visitors are allowed to do what you're usually not allowed to do in an exhibition, which means you can touch the work and you can take all the works home. And this exhibition had a lot to do with Felix González Torres, because Felix and Christian Boltanski met each other and they actually realized a collaboration in Santiago de Compostela. And here you have basically Christian Boltanski's homage to Felix, combining his own, clothes, stacks of clothes, which visitors can take away, with the stacks of Felix, which are spread throughout the space. So this is really a collaboration, between the two of them. And based on that, we developed a whole group show. Here you have Otobong Nakanga. Here you have Luigi Ontani, or Luis Kamnitzer with the stamps, where again, wherever the exhibition goes, and it's again been on the road, these shows have been touring for more than 20 years, wherever the exhibition goes, we make a local research and look at which artists have locally worked on art which goes beyond the gallery, which has to do with this idea of generosity, of dissemination, very much the idea of Felix González Torres. And it's of course wonderful because Felix is so much at the origin of the friendship with Rosa and Carlos. So very important for me tonight to talk about Felix and the memory of Felix González Torres. Here, another view of Take Me, I'm Yours, because of course also Fluxus plays a big role, because in Fluxus you had all these instructions with John Cage and of course also with Alison Knowles. And Alison Knowles had a really great idea at the very beginning of Do It. She says, why would people take things away and not bring things? It has to be both. So she invites the visitors in each city to bring objects to the museum. Here at Villa Medici, she invited everybody in Rome to bring their red objects to the gallery. And at the end of the show, you had thousands and thousands of red objects. And in a way, everything I'm talking about tonight, and I think everything I do, has to do with Edouard Glissant. So I wanted to somehow talk a little bit about how Glissant influenced me and how he influenced my thinking on exhibitions. And I have a ritual that every morning when I wake up, I read for 15 minutes Edouard Glissant. And it's really extremely urgent to read Edouard Glissant. I think he is the most urgent author for the 21st century. And at the same time, I think it's also urgent to kind of reintroduce rituals in our world. It's something Tarkovsky once said. He says, we lack rituals. And so I've always believed that we need to invent new rituals. So when I moved to London in 2006, together with my urbanist friends Marcus Miesen and Shumon Bazar, we felt that it's a pity that we always have to plan meetings with friends such a long time in advance, because everybody's busy and one has to schedule, and how nice it would be if one could just improvise, right? Let's meet tomorrow. And so we decided to start the Brutally Early Club, which gathers always at 6 a.m. And the great thing about that is that nobody can tell you that they have prior schedule. So, we could basically announce it the night before and say, tomorrow we're going to gather. And then at the beginning it was kind of a failure. It was just the three of us. And then it became a rumor. It's a little bit like with my kitchen show. My curating started when I was in Switzerland, when I was a student. I did an exhibition in my kitchen with Fischli Weiss and Frédéric Bourly-Boisbré and different artists. And this exhibition lasted for 3 months, and it had only 28 visitors. but it subsequently became a rumor. And it's the kind of same thing happened exactly with this brutally early club. And then we basically, a little bit later on, realized that too many people came, so there were hundreds of people, and we didn't have, it was a homeless club, because we just would go to coffee shops. And so obviously the coffee shops were rather confused that all of a sudden 200 people would show up at 6 in the morning. So then we decided to do it at 3 a.m., because that was the idea of two artists, Felix Mili and Georges Pité. They said the city is more magical at 3 a.m. So then we had to find venues open at 3 a.m. Anyway, so these are about rituals. I also buy a book every day. That's another ritual. But the main ritual is to read the writings of Édouard Glissant every morning. And of course, Glissant is so fundamental for ideas of the archipelago, for ideas also of creolization, because he considered the blend of languages and cultures a decisive characteristic of the Antillean identity. His native Creole was formed from a combination of languages, and this for him created something unexpectedly new. And of course, the idea of the archipelago refers to the Antillean archipelago. Glissant came from Martinique, and his whole geography, which he drew here, is incredibly important for him, because he says that they are an island group. These Antillean archipelagos are an island group that has no center, but consists of a string of different islands and cultures. The exchange that takes place between them allows each to preserve their own identity. And here is a quote from Glissant. The American archipelagos are extremely important because it was in these islands that the idea of creolization, that is the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. Continents reject mixings, whereas archipelagic thought makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. I can change through the exchange with you all without losing or diluting my sense of self. And I think that is an incredibly important message for the 21st century, that we can actually change in the exchange with the other, and Glissant teaches us this. And of course, what he also teaches us, which is so important, is that we live in an age of globalization. It's not the first time the world experiences globalization, but it is certainly the most extreme form of globalization, fueled by technology again. And that, of course, leads to a lot of homogenizing forces, to the disappearance of many things. Languages disappear. Susan Hiller made a very beautiful movie, a film, where she shows that every day, we're losing languages. And at the same time, species disappear. The other day, I was with A.S. Byatt having dinner, the great novelist, and she all of a sudden looked at us, we were with friends, and she said, when is the last time you have seen a centipede? So this idea of extinction in our time is something Glissant very much addressed. But he also early on saw that there's going to be a counter-reaction to globalization which will be devastating, a counter-reaction which will lead to new forms of nationalism, to new forms of protectionism, to new forms of racism, to new forms of lack of tolerance. And Glissant, of course, says this has to be vehemently resisted. So what he said is, and this is why it's such a useful toolbox for me, and I think for everyone, is that we need to basically contribute to what he calls mondialité. We need to embrace the possibilities of a truly global dialogue, but we need to do it in a way which is not homogenizing. And that's, in a way what I think we can apply every day with exhibitions. And so shows like Do It or Take Me, I'm Yours are a very direct application of the Glissantian thought. And so having been so inspired by him, we felt at a certain moment that it would be great last year to actually do an exhibition in his honor. An exhibition also which would somehow honor his idea of a museum, because what is important is that Glissant was not only a writer, a philosopher, a poet, but that he also was an activist who wanted to produce reality. We're back to this idea of producing reality. So he was, of course, very involved in the post-colonial struggles, was extremely close friends with, Frantz Fanon, but also he started in 1967 the Institut Martiniquais d'études, which is a school he founded which influenced an entire epoch. And based on that school, he then wanted to do a museum. And that's an incredibly exciting reservoir. He wanted to do a museum which would basically be the museum of this area. He wanted to do a museum of this archipelago. He wanted to put together a historical and comparative encyclopedia of the arts of the Americas. And again, the archipelago served as a model. To quote Clisson, "I imagine the museum as an archipelago, not a continent. It would accordingly have housed not a synthesis serving to standardize, but a network of interrelationships between various traditions and perspectives," end of quote. And that idea, right, that he wanted to create a museum which would not be a synthesis, because he says the synthesis is again homogenizing, is standardizing, but it's a museum which is all about a network of interrelationship between many different temporalities, traditions, perspective, a laboratory really, and it would not be a recapitulation of something which existed in an obvious way. It's the quest for something we don't know yet. We go from one point to the next point, and this museum would take us there without us knowing where we would go. It's a museum, as said Clisson, which will bring the world into contact with the world, and it will bring some of the world's places into contact with other of the world's places. And last but not least, he said, we must multiply the number of worlds inside the museums. Again, something I think of every morning when I wake up. How can we multiply the number of worlds inside the museum? So we wanted with my colleague Assad Raza to do an exhibition which would basically not realize this unrealized museum, but somehow bring it back, bring this reservoir of ideas back, because I think it can inspire the museology and the idea of museums of our time. So here you have a very young artist, Walter Price, who is inspired by Clisson, and then Etel Adnan, who is the same generation as Clisson and knew him very well, a piece of Steve McQueen, which is connected to Clisson, and then Mantia Diawara's extraordinary film. He accompanied Clisson on a boat journey, basically traveling from Europe to Martinique, and documented it in a very long interview, which we see here next to a wall work by Boyd. And at the same time, of course, the artists with whom Clisson was friends. He was extremely close to Wilfredo Lahm, and he was also a very close friend of Matta. And these were the artists who wanted to help him, to build this museum. So we, of course, wanted their work in the exhibition. Then again, a younger practice, the Rux Media Collective, who are very inspired by Glisson's thought and created this installation of Philippe Pareno. Philippe, of course, is very much at the origin of many of my thoughts about, exhibitions as living organisms. Philippe is very much at the origin of many of my thoughts also of how we can, with the exhibition as a medium, create new experiments in art and technology. Because when I was in Paris at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, where I worked in the 90s, we worked on an exhibition with Philippe, where he invited Jaron Lanier, the inventor of virtual reality, long time before this notion was widespread, to actually do this exhibition with him. So we had kind of VR before VR. And here you have Philippe's homage to Clisson. Or again, Walter Price, here with Simone Fatal, who again knew Clisson well. And then the exhibition toured. And again, it's not really a tour, because I don't believe in tours. It somehow evolved, morphed, changed into the American Society in New York City, where those of you who are going to be in New York, you can still see it until the 12th of January. And of course, we knew from the beginning that we wanted to change the exhibition, because already Clisson having inspired us to let exhibitions grow and evolve and change, we had to apply his own methodology to his own show. But little did we know what would happen in New York, because something truly extraordinary happened, because we collaborated with the formidable director of the American Society, Gabriela Rangel. And Gabriela Rangel basically had this epiphany that we would actually combine Clisson with Lydia Cabrera. Lydia Cabrera, who spent many years of her life in Miami, that's a very interesting connection to Miami, was also a friend of Wilfredo Lahm, like Clisson. Again, Lahm, inspired. She was a painter, a cosmologist, a linguist, an ethnographer, an anthropologist, a botanical taxonomist, and at the same time, like Clisson, an anti-colonial force. Lydia Cabrera was many. It's a very 21st century position with all these activities, she had. And of course, for me, recording interviews, I got super inspired by her recording of the traditions and languages of the Yoruba and the Bantus, cultures that continue to grow in the Americas, with which she actually complicated a nationalist identity. And she really protested against the disappearance of these cultures. She brought them back and created through the oral history a kind of memory, which of course, is the idea of recording these conversations. It's in a way, I think we live in an age where we have more and more information. In our digital age, there is an exponential explosion of information, but maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that we have more memory. It could somehow very well be that amnesia is somewhere at the core of this digital age, why I think, it's kind of our job to protest against forgetting. And that's certainly what Lydia Cabrera did, with an archive to celebrate. She celebrated the plurality of Cuban cultures. And it's very important that she did actually not refer to these stories as transcriptions, but as transpositions. And so what's the difference between a transcription and a transposition? That's, of course, again, super inspiring for me, because I've got thousands of transcriptions of, my interviews, which are all filmed and audio recorded. So Cabrera says transpositions preserve an integral part of oral storytelling, the ability to change and morph, to remain fluid with each performance according to the audience. And that, of course, this fluidity connects us very much to what Glissant said about his museum, this archipelago museum, which refuses a synthesis and shows a network of interrelationship. It will remain always active. And so as a storyteller, Lydia Cabrera playfully subverts the feeling that one is getting an unaltered historic record by disrupting the reader's temporality. So here you have, for example, Tania Bruguera, who was very inspired by Lydia Cabrera with an early work, and Antonio Segui. Here you have connections to Glissant with basically two works. You have the work of Darwin Stingland, you have also the work of Cruz. And this exhibition brings together the world of Cabrera and the world of Glissant. And that all thanks to this epiphany of Gabriela Rangel. She really, thought, and the more we studied, the more we realized these common points. And of course, there is also the exile to Paris. Our dream is to somehow have this exhibition go to all the places where Glissant and Cabrera worked, to their multiple exiles, Miami, and of course Paris, because Glissant and Cabrera spent a lot of time in Paris. And it will be, of course, very important to also find a way of showing it in Martinique. Here you see another change which happened in New York City, because I remember that Glissant, of course, taught at NYU, and he was friends with many artists in New York City. So we wanted to mobilize Glissant's artist friends from New York to join the exhibition. In the background, you have drawings by Jack Whitten. So Jack Whitten was one of the legendary painter, was one of Glissant's closest friends. Whenever he came to New York, they hang out, also Melvin Edwards. And then, of course, in the middle again, the Leporello, which Etel Adnan drew especially for Edouard Glissant. And I talked about extinction and this whole idea that we need to protest against extinction, that things could disappear. So, and that brings us to social media and brings us to my Instagram account, which is a protest against the disappearance of handwriting and doodling. And so I never knew what to do with social media. I kind of knew that what I didn't want to do, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I wanted to find something which is urgent. So then Ryan Trecartin, we were with him and Kevin McGarry basically having breakfast 6 years ago. And all of a sudden Ryan took my phone and downloaded the app of Instagram. And then he told all his many followers that I had joined Instagram. So then, it was kind of like be thrown into the water. I had to somehow find a way of doing something. And then I had a lot of terrible ideas. So the first idea was that I thought that whenever I meet an artist, I could ask them to do something for Instagram. And created an awkward situation because, of course, most cases it wasn't really obvious what to do and how one could actually then translate it into the medium. So it was kind of not happening within the medium. And then we were with my partner Cruz, the artist, and Simone Fatal, the artist, and Etel Adnan on a vacation in Brittany. And and it suddenly started to rain, and we had to kind of basically find shelter from the rain, and we sat in this coffee shop, and it just would not stop. The rain would not stop, like 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. And so we had an incredible conversation, and then after several hours, the inevitable happened. We go on our phones, and the only person who didn't go on her phone was, of course, Etel, because she's in her early 90s, and she wouldn't go on her iPhone or on her smartphone. She would basically take a piece of paper and start to write a poem. And the week before, I had visited Umberto Eco, was the visit I made with him in Milan. And Umberto Eco was really upset because he says, calligraphy disappears, handwriting disappears, you have to do something. It is your mission, you have to do something. And I always loved this idea that, artists or writers encourage me to do urgent things. It started at the very beginning when I was a teenager, and I was like 16, 17, I started to visit artists by night train, like all over Europe. And I went by night train to Cologne to see Gerhard Richter and to also see Rosemarie Trockel. And Rosemarie Trockel said something which was kind of, led to all these interviews, because she basically says it was the moment when Louise Bourgeois was finally getting the attention she deserves, right, in the 80s. And Rosemarie says there are so many more artists, pioneering artists, so many women artists who need to have more visibility. And Rosemarie said, she would love to do that, just to go from city to city and try to find artists. And she said, but she doesn't have the time. She's an artist. She has to do her own work. But she says, that's a good project for you. And so, ever since, when I go to a city, I said, who is the Louise Bourgeois, who is a pioneering artist in this city, whom I have to visit. And it became a very important aspect of my, of my research, and leads to many exhibitions, and leads, for example, to our summer show next summer at the Serpentine, because last year, about a year and a half ago, I was in LA for studio visits, and we were visiting studios, and again I asked the Rosemarie Trockel question, and I was told that I had to visit Lucita Hurtado, who is a 99-year-old artist who had never had an exhibition in a museum, and had created extraordinary paintings for more than 70 years. She was part of Surrealism, was in Mexico with Wolfgang Paalen, Leonora Carrington, that generation. She then was in San Francisco, again part of an avant-garde, then moved to LA in the 60s, became a very important part of the feminist movement there. So she had so many lives, so many important moments where she contributed to art history, but it had never been brought together. And so very, very, very excited to do this exhibition next summer at the Serpentine in tandem with the first European survey of Faith Ringgold, which will happen at the Serpentine. So these two exhibitions will be our summer shows. So in a way, again, there the protest against forgetting of two incredibly pioneering artists who have never had this, big museum show in Europe, which will be realized. But to come back to this, so Umberto Eco was to my Instagram what Rosemarie Trockel, was to my interview project, because Umberto Eco said, you've got to do something. So I was always thinking every day, I've got to do something. And the moment I saw Etel write this poem, on a piece of paper, I had found my Instagram idea. Because I thought that is just going to be the daily practice. I meet artists every day. I meet, architects, poets every day. I will always ask them to write a sentence. And so it's been going on now for 6 years almost. And I just brought a few examples. So it's Gustav Metzger, the late Gustav Metzger, all of us together. He developed little by little through my Instagram what he called the extinction handwriting. And then, of course, there are also artists who don't want to be on Instagram, who then basically use my Instagram to be their Instagram. So it's almost like a Russian matryoshka, right? Their Instagram is within my Instagram, and that's the case for Henri Sala. He's doing a clock every week, and I always post it. So there are many Henri Sala clocks, within my Instagram. And here are just a few examples: the Cosmic Web of Thomas Saraceno, Jane Goodall, again the togetherness, which is so important. Our collaboration between Alex Israel and Bret Easton Ellis. And that, of course, leads us a little bit also to an evolution of the Instagram, because at some point we thought it could be interesting to have several people do it. And that actually happened after one of the experiments with art and technology, when we were with Hito Steyerl and Ben Vickers, our Chief Technology Officer. We were in a canteen actually of the lab where we had the experiments, and all of a sudden Ben said, "Why don't you do exquisite corpse?" Because of course the surrealists had done exquisite corpse, which is such a lovely game we can always play when we're with 3 or 4 friends. You take a piece of paper, you fold it, and then you can't watch what the other person does, but then the connection is made, and at the end you unfold it, and the thing is, it always works. So that, of course, is somehow a quasi-exquisite corpse, and I started then a series, with 3 or 4 artists. Whenever I'm with 3 or 4 artists, we now have, and that's another Instagram within the Instagram. Here, Rikrit. And then a motto of Etel Adnan, which I have on the door of my office, which I really love, which again I think is a very urgent message for the 21st century. Kushanga. And then, last but not least, I wanted to end with a kind of opening to a new project where basically we are working with Alex Poots, who is the CEO and artistic director of the Shed in New York City. Alex and I have been working a lot in Manchester for the Manchester International Festival over the last sort of 12 years. And then Alex moved to New York to start this new institution, the Shed, which is a building on wheels. It's a movable structure by Dilla Scofidio Renfro and David Rockwell, an interdisciplinary structure where all the disciplines will come together: music, performance, dance, choreography, art, literature, and so on, opera. And basically in Manchester, whilst Alex was in Manchester, we did a lot of experiments with live art. It was somehow, I found it very urgent. In dialogue with artists came up all these ideas to do exhibitions where artists would be given time to do operas, and they of course couldn't really happen in a museum. And so it was particularly with Philippe Pareno, we wanted to do an opera for many years, and we never could do it, because when we went to see opera directors, they said, this is a museum show, you should do it in the art world. But in the art world, we don't have an opera house. So we got stuck. And then Alex started this new festival in Manchester called the MIF, and it was 13 years ago. And all of a sudden, these things could happen, because it was basically possible to do our opera, called Postman Time, where we gave every artist 15 minutes, and the artists would basically, do a time-based group show. We also did this show with Klaus Biesenbach called 11, 12, 13 Rooms, where with Santiago Sierra and Tino Segal and also Yoko Ono, and many, Dominique Gonzalez-Förster, many different artists who would basically do living sculptures. So it would be like a sculpture with opening hours from 10 to 6. The only difference would be that the sculpture would go home at 6 p.m. And so all of these experiments, happened because the festival became, in a way, a productive context to do art shows. And then, of course, when Alex moved to New York to do this new institution, the Shed, we decided to continue the collaboration, and I worked with him as his senior artistic advisor. And so we decided to do this prelude to the Shed, and I thought it's kind of maybe as an end of this talk, an opening to a kind of a new project. And we invited Kunle Adeyemi, the architect, Nigerian architect who is based in Amsterdam, to develop in close dialogue with Tino Segal a structure which could move, which would be flexible, so that lots of different practices could happen at the same time. So all of a sudden the walls could come out, and you would of course have an archive presentation of the historic Fram Palace of Cedric Price, which is an inspiration for this idea of an interdisciplinary organization. So as you can see, it's not only Edouard Glissant's museum. It's also lots of other unrealized kind of utopic institutions which I think can inspire us today. And Cedric Price wanted with John Littlewood, they wanted to build the Fun Palace, which was an extraordinary infrastructure where lots of interdisciplinary projects could happen in the early 60s. So we created an archive presentation, and it's always complicated, you know, to present an archive and embody it. And that's a whole other lecture, which I'm not going to do tonight, which is how to actually curate an archive. Because I think it's interesting how we can actually make an archive a living archive, how we can bring it to life. And that's what happened here with these trolleys. Initially, an idea developed also with Herzog de Meuron for a Swiss architecture pavilion. You know, I curated, and so Kunle Adeyemi's walls could suddenly move, and then you had these trolleys, and there was an archive presentation, and the archive presentation could suddenly go into a choreography performance with a new piece by William Forsythe and a new collaboration with Flex. And then all of a sudden, you know, it would go into music, and you would basically have Abra, or you would have Abra or Arca, you know, do a musical performance, and then all of a sudden it would switch again, and you would have Asad Raza's Cool, and then it would switch again, and you have Tino Segal's, you know, live art piece, and then it would switch again, and you would have a lecture. And all of these things could somehow be fluid. And last but not least, I wanted to encourage you to call these numbers. Because basically, for the exhibition of Cabrera and Glissant, Philippe Pareno created this new piece where, and it's again to do with archive, where we gathered archives of the voices of Lydia Cabrera and Edouard Glissant. And the voice of Glissant comes from my archive, because I've got about 50 interviews with him on all these different key topics. There's also opacity, there is archipelago, there is creolization. So we use that. And for Lydia Cabrera, whom I sadly never met, it's basically recordings we found. And I can again want to emphasize again how grateful I am to Gabriela Rangel for making us discover Lydia Cabrera. Because I think reading it more and more now, that over the next couple of years, it's going to become a new ritual to read Lydia Cabrera every morning when I wake up. And we also have to say that so many of her texts have not been translated yet. So that's another reason why we're doing these shows, is to hopefully trigger more translation of all the Glissant texts and the Lydia Cabrera texts not yet translated. And if you call these numbers, you will meet Lydia and Edouard. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Hans Ulrich. Well, you know, he's our friend, and this has been a wonderful evening, and it's for everyone, as he says. And I believe that Hans Ulrich is the person, he's really an intellectual, but he's so reachable that we became friends before Basel. And I remember the day he told me at the Sir John Soane's Museum in London, Rosa, there's an artist that needs money to finish his work. And his name was Isaac Julien. And I had never met Isaac Julien. So I walk into the Sir John Soane's Museum, and I see this man. He was a black man, very nice. And he says, hello, you are Isaac Julien? He says, yes. Well, Hans Ulrich told me that you need money because you can't finish your piece. He was filming inside the Sir John's Museum. I said, yeah, but you don't know me. I said, we don't need to know each other. Hans Ulrich says that you need the money, so here's the money. And it was about $12,000 that he needed, and we felt, and then when the thing is, because this is all due to Hans Ulrich, then he was one of the finalists for the Turner Prize in London, and he became really famous. So this man, which I had never met, and I gave him that money, he calls me and said, Rosa and Carlos, now that I'm famous, I want to give you my work. So he gave us an edition, which actually, the other day I mentioned it to Franklin Sermon here at the museum in Palm, because it's a piece that I would like it to go to a museum. Well, this is a museum, but it's a piece that should be in a major museum, because it has a story, and I think that story ends with Hans Ulrich. He is really, I hope he comes every year. You can imagine when Yvette and, we managed to reach him. And I know he always comes for us because he came for the Moore Space also. But I hope next year we can have you on Monday before Basel, Hans Ulrich Obrist. Okay? Thank you for coming, everybody.